And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely, with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman.
In the very first verse here, 21:9, it says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian. I like how they pointed out the Egyptian. They never want to forget that. Whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. I thought that was odd to me for a couple reasons. One, because it doesn't make sense in the story at all. Unless we assume that maybe when Ishmael was roughly the same age, he never got the same treatment. I can see where he might scoff at his brother. However, based on what we know about Abraham, that seems unlikely. Abraham seems to want to take care of Ishmael throughout the story so far. But I also found interesting there's a lot of variance in how this gets translated. It turns out that probably a better translation, and this is going to open a can of worms, is that Isaac wasn't being scoffed at by Ishmael. Ishmael was playing with Isaac, not scoffing at Isaac. And this is actually seen as well in the Greek text of the Old Testament. So in the Septuagint, it translated as playing as well. Now, one would ask, what in the world is a 14-year-old boy playing with a very young, 3-year-old Isaac? You weaned a child roughly around age 3 at that time. What in the world would they be playing? Now, here's my theory. I don't think Ishmael was playing with Isaac at 14. I think he was playing with Isaac at probably 4 or 5. I think they were closer in age than the narrative has led us to believe, and I think that becomes very clear when they go out into the desert.
Well, what was the age difference?
Well, it was supposed to be, roughly 14 years, 13 years.
And what do you
Well,
think it was?
it's roughly 13 years between the birth of Ishmael and Isaac, and then an additional 3 years for the weaning. So at this point, we would assume that Ishmael is, anywhere between 15 and 16, somewhere in there.
And Isaac?
Isaac probably roughly around the age of 3.
Okay.
So,
I mean, that's a bit of a difference, right?
It is a bit of a difference, but when we read the rest of this narrative, it really reads as though Ishmael is much younger.
Oh, okay. And
in fact, it almost reads to me like this part of the narrative used to be part of the chapter 16 narrative where they go out to the desert and the Lord meets them out there. Let's read through the rest of this narrative, and then we'll go through the comments.
Okay.
Dan, can you read through?
So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And when the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, Let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept.
So here, specifically, again, this is a goofy translation. This is not a good translation. What it should be translated as is he placed Ishmael on her shoulders, what it really says, and then he handed the water to Ishmael. So Ishmael is small enough in the Hebrew text here that he can be placed on the shoulders of his mother. And then that fits as well with the rest of the story because they go out into the desert And once they finish the water, it is Ishmael who is on the edge of death. But if we are to believe that he's 16 years old, how is he not in the prime of his life? How is he not the one that's in good health, and his mother not the one that's on the edge of...
Also, he'd probably be crushing her. Right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, he'd be crushing her. But, I mean, second of all, if you imagine you're 16 years old, you're in the desert with your mother. Let's assume, based on everything we know about Hagar, she loves her son and she wants to protect him. Let's assume that they at least drank the water evenly. So they're both equally as, hydrated or dehydrated. Mm-hmm. I have to assume that Ishmael's mom would have been the one that would be succumbing to the heat, not Ishmael, if Ishmael is in the prime of his life at 16.
That makes sense.
But if Ishmael is just, a couple years older than Isaac, he's still a young boy, not a lad, a very young boy at this stage. Well, yeah, of course he's going to succumb to the desert heat. It's going to be virtually unbearable for him. So anyways, the story goes on, and she places him under a bush. Well, how do you place a 16-year-old boy under a bush? I mean, presumably he doesn't weigh much. She's really strong, and the bush is gigantic. Like, how is that going to play out? And then when God visits her, he commands her to lift up the boy and hold him with your hand.
With one hand.
Yeah, I mean, it just... The whole narrative to me reads, especially if you get rid of some of the goofy English translations, the narrative to me reads as though he is still a little boy, and this is probably part of the Genesis 16 narrative that at some point became a disconnected story. It's one of those things where the narrative started out as the same part of the same story, but the stories, as they migrated to different territories, they changed enough that one story became two separate stories because details get mixed up. Mm-hmm. That's the nature of oral traditions. And that's the hard part about Genesis. That's why there's so many in Genesis and Exodus, there's so many doublets.
Right, yeah. Because they're trying to reconcile with the North and the South.
They're trying to form a meta-narrative that includes everybody's foundational stories. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that means you have double stories that probably were the same story at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyways, all that to just to explain the age situation. But needless to say, I'm not the first person to notice the fact that Ishmael was placed on the shoulders of his mother, according to the original language. That seems to be a common enough translation. At least it was at some point before English translators tried to smooth it out.